In studio with us, Shaykh Ihsaan Taliep, as we continue unpacking the article by Dr. Umar Faruq Abd Allah entitled Islam and the Cultural Imperative. Shaykh Ihsaan, assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Hajja Khadija, and shukran so very much once again. Happy to be here and with the listeners, alhamdulillah.
So, Sheikh, for the past few weeks, of course, as we've been unpacking this article, we've looked at what culture is. We've unpacked a little bit around that. We looked at how it is so that culture roots us, how imperative it is. But there's also no such thing as one culture being more superior to another. Sheikh referenced, of course, for us repeatedly Quran that speaks about this. But we also spoke about the impacts of particular cultures, on our patterns of behavior, how it becomes entrenched, how we enact it in various ways where we spoken about, for example, what in a South African situation, what apartheid did to us as well, and how people have been in many ways robbed from their culture. And then as we spoke about cultures, and then we also last week questioned the fact that when we speak about a culture that dominates or sort of a worldview, are we conflating the idea of culture with actually what is a worldview? When we look at superstructures and we look at the fact that it's become so profit-centered, and that cannot possibly be culture, because when we speak about culture, it's about the human being at the center, and patterns of behavior, as we said, and it's about respecting other cultures and understanding, the differences. We went back to our previous conversations around commonalities and diversities and particularities and so on, and of course asking this question: what does being a Muslim in Cape Town look like? And this in one sense forces us to question ourselves, and what type of patterns of behavior do we adopt that makes us feel almost a sense of superiority as Muslims, and how important it is that we constantly remind ourselves, about culture being of, if you like, of benefit as well, that we cannot be selective in as far as, or we need to be clear about what is culture and what is a dominant worldview.
Absolutely, Auntie Khadija. And so it's obviously one that is located within awareness and consciousness, because the worldview and that which is predominant within society, sometimes if we are just, let's say, obliviously proceeding along the path of life, then we can, obviously, the most logical thing will be that we would be swallowed up by that dominant culture. That dominant culture, as you correctly say, in the world today is a materialist, it is a capitalist, it is a liberal culture, which is what Western civilization, quote unquote, in its finest represents to humankind today. And we know how problematic that, especially at this juncture in history, is for humankind, let alone for the Muslim Ummah of Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And especially an ummah which has a message, a ummah which has a mission. And that mission is to bring the Islamic worldview, is to bring the Islamic civilizational impulse and alternative, in a sense, sort of superstructure for humankind. And the only way to do that is to live authentically in terms of who we are on the ground, and perfectly and harmoniously infused with the universal values of our faith and our deen, that allows humankind to recognize, acknowledge, and or the rest of humankind who live in our context, to recognize and acknowledge it and actually relate to it. It's like the example that we used also with our young children from the African townships, and how when, we had the experience of the graduation ceremony and the dressing of the young children, which we suggested to the Sheikh should be in authentic Xhosa, sort of, in the finest of what the Xhosa culture has to offer. Let them dress in those ways so that the society around them can actually relate to them and say, this is what Islam brings out within our people. It brings the best out of our Xhosa culture to the fore, and so forth. You understand? And so again, the notion of that unity in diversity. And so all of this today, of course, as you have alluded, we'll be talking about the classical sort of construct in the fiqh, in the jurisprudence when it comes to culture. And so essentially the word culture is a bit of a more modern terminology. And so in our traditional and classical fiqh, we speak about the urf and the aada of people. So this has got to do with the in a sense, the practical manifestations of a culture. So when we talk about the urf, we talk about that which is the customs and the habits and the norms of either the society or of even individuals, right? And so also the word aada is kind of synonymous with the word urf, but it speaks more of the aada, the cultural norms of people and so forth, as opposed to the aada of the society. But okay, so those are our classical terminologies. And so from a perspective of definitions, they certainly bear the connotation of those aspects of local culture which are generally recognized as good, beneficial, or they are neutral in society. So it's good and beneficial aspects of a local culture, or it is neutral. And of course, the adoption thereof on that specific definitional basis, that which is good, that which is beneficial, or that which is neutral. In other words, it's mubah. And as we know in our deen, there is this notion that al-aslu fil ashya'i al-ibaha. It says that the general norm or the general rule pertaining to all things in the deen of Islam is the norm of permissibility. Everything in its essence is originally permissible until and unless there is a specific textual sort of representation in the Quran or the Hadith that varies or modifies that original status. It either then makes it from permissible to something which is unlawful, or makes it something which is, for example, compulsory to do. And so the local culture, in other words, is appraised, and it does not amount to a blanket acceptance of culture. So one would understand, for example, in certain historical contexts, honor killings, for example, and Khadija, as the Sheikh mentions, these were cultural things, right? And so, Allah forbid, these things still unfortunately appear from time to time, even in this day and age. And so that, of course, doesn't matter how much the culture of a people recognizes honor killings, and also in Muslim countries. There's no way that in Islam we can in any way or form accept it and make it part of what urf and the aada, which is acceptable in the Sharia. And then also in our more sort of contemporary sort of Western liberal culture, the so-called sexual revolution and the promiscuity, these part of the Western culture, Khadija. This is whether we like it or not. There's no way that from an Islamic perspective, so there's no blanket acceptance of culture. It's only that which is good, that which is beneficial, or that which is neutral within human societies. And so therefore, and Khadija, to having mentioned those extremes, the one about honor killings, and the one on the other extreme about sexual promiscuity, which becomes the culture and the order of the day, regrettably. And so therefore, when we interact with people, we obviously interact, and we're not saying that only Muslims observe these kinds of norms. People of other faiths as well, they also preserve at times, and but these, of course, are kind of more the exception than the norm. And so from the classical fiqh and Khadija, we have what are known as the 5 universal maxims, right? And so of those maxims, those legal maxims, qawaid fiqhiyya, the scholars have coined the term al-'adatu muhakkama, and that is the cultural usage shall have the weight of law. anything which is within the cultural realm of a society shall carry the weight of law. Right? And so that's one of the 5 universal legal maxims. And so that's quite, in a sense, sort of, in a sense, occupying a prominent position within the legal framework of the Sharia. And so there are certain variations also of that, which we will for now skip. But that is the essence of that maxim, as is coined in that particular way. And so we find then, therefore, that when it comes to the application of law, it then, under the working of this particular maxim, requires and obliges the jurisconsult to take the local customs and norms of people into square consideration and into a specific consideration and recognition before final formulation of laws are in actual fact formulated, right, and concluded. And so verses even of the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about how the processes of nafaqah, for example, of the husband towards his family and his wife should be done bil ma'ruf, and so the scholars, they take that phrase bil ma'ruf and again look at its morpheme, its original 3-letter construction, which is based on the word ain, ra, fa, and so here references is then made to the urf. So when Allah says, and the person to whom a child is born, and in terms of his wife, it is obligatory upon him to give them clothing and to give them to feed them bil ma'ruf, in accordance with what is customarily acceptable in that society. And so one can then therefore understand that a particular society may have different cultural sort of norms and standards, and that may differ from society to society. And so that, I think, is also reflected in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, when he once was asked by Hind, the wife of Muawiyah, after he embraced Islam. She came and complained to the Prophet that he is stingy and not providing her and her child with nafaqah. So the Prophet ﷺ handed down a verdict at that moment, and he said, take of his money ما يكفيك وولدك بالمعروف, that which is sufficient for you and for your child, in accordance with the customary practice of society. Okay, so that again brings in square focus the idea of how the formulation of the ahkam must take the customary usage and practices of people into consideration. Okay, so some of the scholars here go a little bit more sort of emphatically, and they say that a fatwa that is formulated, right, that does not take the cultural usage into consideration has no meaning at all. So the jurisconsult or the mufti, his rejection of cultural usage has no meaning at all, and so to follow sound custom is an obligation. This was the words of Abdul Wahhab al-Baghdadi, who was a famous judge of his time in the 11th century. Another famous Hanafi jurist by the name of Sarakhsi, he says that whatever is established by sound custom is equally well established by sound legal proof. And so we have an Arabic version of that that says al-ma'rufi urfan kal-mashru'i shar'an. That which is known and established by the urf and the adas of people is as valid and established as that which is established in the Sharia. Shar'an. Okay. And so again, as we have said, all the time under the operation of that definition that says that which is beneficial, that which is good, and that which is neutral, right? And not the things which, of course, stand at variance with the values of Islam. And so the famous 14th century Imam al-Shatibi, right, he cautioned and he said, that juristic incompetence could impose no difficulty upon a people harsher than to require them to repudiate their sound local customs and conventional usage. And these judgments, he insists, should always rather be in harmony with the good aspects of local culture that fulfill the fundamental Islamic legal objectives of buttressing society's general well-being. A people cannot be placed in more difficulty than to be required to leave off and to reject that which they are accustomed to, which is customary known to them. In other words, it's familiar to them. If you are thrown into the unfamiliar, you are thrown into the uncertain, you are thrown into that which is not known to you, you become, as a human being, filled with anxiety, filled with fear, and filled with all sorts of negative sort of emotions and things. And so, to this end, of course, Islam's objective is about raf'ul haraj, is to alleviate difficulty for human beings. That is the preeminent principle in Islam, which speaks to the maslahah, that which is beneficial and that which is facilitating for human beings. And accompanying that also is then to alleviate hardships, to alleviate difficulty for all people. And so, therefore, also, if we then consider that if culture plays such an important role, any viable culture, which is a culture of, of communities who are recognized as civilizational entities, etc., that it is just a norm that in human beings, cultures undergo change. And so the recognition of change within culture is equally recorded within our jurisprudence and within our fiqh, to the extent that it says that so when the culture changes, then the verdict that was previously attached to the previous culture should also change. And the hukum should also change. And so we have this qaida that says, لا ينكر تغير الأحكام بتغير الأزمان. It should not be frowned upon that the change of ahkam will occasion the change in time and place. In other words, the change within the cultural sort of manifestations in people in different places and in different times, right? And so that which has, again, like we said, recognition in culture and in law in culture has recognition in law. Right? So these are some of the sort of ahkam which our ulama essentially agree upon. And so one of the very famous Syrian scholars, Ibn Abidin, he warned that any jurors who held unbendingly to the standard legal decisions of his school, in other words, of his madhab, without regard to changing times and circumstances, would necessarily obliterate fundamental rights and extensive benefits, bringing about harm far exceeding any good he might possibly achieve. He further asserted that such blindness, in other words, just to stick unbendingly and tenaciously to a madhab without due consideration for changes within the contextual realities and the cultural realities of people, that such blindness constituted nothing less than an oppression and gross injustice. Okay? And so further, it's worthy, I think, for us to also mention another great jurist, which is a Maliki jurist from the 13th century, Imam al-Qarafi. He said that persons handing down legal judgments, so now we're talking again about the preview and the purview of the mufti, he hands down a fatwa blindly to the texts in their books without regard for the cultural realities of the people are in gross error. So we read a book of a scholar who lived in a past period or in a past time. So we refer to them as the yellow pages, because they are like books that the pages have already become yellow because of its passage of time. So they are old. And so a person, Imam Qarafi says, that sticks to the text in these books without regard for the change in the realities of the people, they are in gross error. Right? And so they act in a contradiction to established legal consensus and are guilty of iniquity and disobedience before God, having no excuse despite their ignorance, For they have taken upon themselves the art of issuing legal rulings, in other words, fatwas, without being worthy of that practice. Their blind adherence to what is written down in the legal compendia. And now this is the thing. We obviously train ourselves on the basis of the legal compendia. But the legal compendia were compiled by the previous jurors precisely within the context of what their realities and their experiences and cultural sort of manifestations were during their times. Our responsibility would be to look at how they apply the principles in the same way that they did in their context. Culturally, we will have to do within our current context, as opposed to blindly taking from the legal compendia and then issue rulings accordingly. Their blind adherence is misguidance in the religion of Islam and utter ignorance of the ultimate objectives, the maqasid, behind the rulings of the earlier scholars and the great personages of the past whom they claim to be imitating. So these are the words of Imam al-Qarafi. Another great scholar that followed him was also somebody who met him is Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawzi, and he commended the statement of Imam al-Qarafi, and he says, this is the pure understanding of the law, and whoever issues legal rulings to the people merely on the basis of what is transmitted in the legal compendia, despite differences in their customs, the usages, the times, the place, the conditions, and the special circumstances of the situations, has gone astray and lead others astray. His crime against the religion is greater than the crime of a physician who gives people medical prescriptions without regard to the differences of their climes, the norms, the times they live in, and their physical natures, but merely in accordance with what he finds written down in some medical book about people with similar anatomies.
It's heavy.
So I think it is important that we kind of allow this to somehow, sink in. And but again, it is just profoundly logical. It's just profoundly common sense. And so sometimes we forget how the deen of Islam, especially when it comes to the interactions of human beings, we exclude the dimensions of the ibadat, because these are the things which will never change. That how we worship Allah will never change. How we perform salah will never change, etc., etc. But how we interact with human beings, the Sharia is eminently and preeminently compatible with all times and changes based on these, the workings of these structures and principles in the Sharia.
Absolutely. It takes me back to when we spoke last week, and Sheikh, you alluded to that now. So firstly, I want to say, and I suppose I want to put it out there as a question also. So would this be what when we refer to the spirit of the law, as opposed to the letter of the law? So the letter of the law is quite clear. It's cold. It's clinical.
Yes.
It's something that's very precise, or that very prescriptive also. The spirit of the law is indicative of those, the culture,
Absolutely.
the circumstances, and I just want to make it real again for us and refer back to the example that Sheikh gave us last week when we think about in Cape Town that in even though Muslims are a minority, there's a dominant culture amongst Muslims. What a Muslim looks like, if one can put it in that way. Associations with what his or her name would be, an Arabic name, a particular mode of dress, particular skin color,
Absolutely.
particular way of talking, etc., etc. And Sheikh, in your opening remarks, you spoke again about this. For example, a celebratory event as like a graduation, where if somebody from a Zulu background, for example, is graduating, or we can use any other example,
Precisely.
a name giving,
Yes.
a birthing experience in our community. And when I say our community, I mean the dominant Muslim culture. So we conflate that with a type of religiosity. And we say that this is what our religion is about. But here, this is exactly what we were talking about.
Yes.
That culture needs to be considered. And it's not for us to decide what being Muslim looks like, how we ought to be.
Absolutely. And so again, unity in cultural diversity then is the hallmark of traditional Islamic societies. And so when we look now to the point about Islamic cultural history, a guy that comes to mind in all of this is this famous traveler, Ibn Battuta. So Sheikh also, cites him. And Ibn Battuta's journey is, he compares it also with Marco Polo, who's kind of, in the European context, a person who journeyed throughout the world, right? But Ibn Battuta covered, he says, twice as much distance and countries that Marco Polo had done. But Ibn Battuta, having, chosen very explicitly his journeys to go along the routes of Muslim countries and Muslim places, he would find himself in familiar surroundings wherever he went throughout the Muslim world, because like that life-giving river, the water is Islam. It's just the complexion looks different depending on where the river is being investigated and inspected and encountered. So he says, however, on the contrary, that Marco Polo, he probably traveled a few days out of Venice, and then he found himself in foreign lands because of the lack of this sort of unity that Islam's people managed to manifest. And so this is what he encountered throughout his travels. And so when he went, for example, as far afield as China, as well as in the Indian Ocean, and he came to sub-Saharan Africa, the question was that he, in actual fact, generally felt at home. And don't we feel the same? It's like, to a certain degree, when you go on Hajj, for example, and you meet this United Nations of people, and we all just have this affinity for one another, and we kind of relate to one another, and we connect with one another. It doesn't matter, and some people, those who are going on Hajj, this must be something you do consciously on a daily basis, to make connections with people from the vast, cultural manifestation representations of this ummah, this great diversity that the ummah represents. It is a travesty if we stick only to our own kind, whilst we are in this melting pot of human beings in one place, as Allah has designed. And so therefore you should make that part of your journey and part of your learning. But we recognize one another. We instantaneously, in a sense, relate to one another, as well as, in effect, have affection for one another. A complete stranger. And how beautiful it is when you start greeting Assalamu alaikum, and all of those commonalities. And so, having said that, like you said earlier on, Khadija, that doesn't mean, of course, so whilst there's a lingua franca dimension of the Arabic language that binds the ummah, doesn't mean, in fact, Ibn Ashur is one of the great maqasidi scholars and minds within the realm of the higher objectives of the Sharia, has a chapter that deals with separating Arabic culture from what is representative of Islam. Because the Prophet ﷺ was an Arab, and so he himself obviously lived as a human being within a particular cultural context. So Islam, Ibn Ashur goes and makes sure that we separate and understand the distinction between Islam and Arab culture. And so that's an important, obviously, conversation also to be had. And so that is culturally, but then also even materially, in the way in which, for example, mosques were constructed. The Prophet ﷺ's mosque was a very plain structure. But very soon afterwards, we found that, domes became synonymous with mosques. Minarets became synonymous with mosques. And we find that no matter where you went across the globe, whether it's Al-Andalus and North Africa, they have a certain sort of architectural influence from the culture of the Visigoths and as well as from the Roman Basilica. Those were the kind of influences that kind of made its mark felt in North Africa. The Ottomans, for example, were different. They had more influence from Greek culture in terms of, the way how Greek churches were designed architecturally and so forth. So we know how the Ottoman mosques, for example, are very distinctive. In China, it's different. East and West Africa, it's different. Indian Muslim India, for example, produced the Taj Mahal, for example. It's like a mosque-like structure, obviously a different purpose, but this became so famous throughout the globe as a manifestation of architectural culture of Muslim India. You understand? And so all of those are ways and beautiful ways in which this tapestry is woven in the context also of that. And let alone the cultural languages and the impression, for example, East Africa of the Swahili language, North and rather West Africa of the Hausa language, and how those became cultural rich reserves of those nations and civilizations on those expansive places. I think, Khadija, for me, if we think about the mosque especially, Sheikh speaks about this also, how Muslims in North America, for example, should think about the role of mosques. This is what we have to think about. If Islam is about service, is about serving humankind, is about being beneficial to humankind, then certainly, in the history of Islam, you have mosques and you have these medical services, you have these little clinics that's attached to mosque, you have the service kitchens, for example, that's attached to mosque, you have schools, for example, that's attached to mosque, and so forth. I think these are the kind of things that we as Muslims also in South Africa need to re-look at, and in more deliberate ways begin to reflect Muslim as well as Islamic culture in terms of being in the service of human beings, and how that becomes the greatest form of da'wah, even in a sense, where you then begin to look at how the needs of humankind is being catered for through the structures of the masajid, right? And how we then begin to see that this becomes part of the purposes behind how the Prophet ﷺ would take care of the needs of society, and all of that occurred from the nucleus of the Muslim community, which was the prophetic mosque. And so instead of having masajid where we only attend, for 10 minutes or 15, maybe maximum 20 minutes, 5 times a day, and the rest of the time the mosque stands empty. This role, especially in a South African context and especially in a Cape Townian context, could begin to energize a cultural identity for the Muslim community that the rest of society not only relates to and recognizes, but orientate to and gravitate toward.
Of course.
And I think that's what culture does for us, and that is obviously, yes, we say it's part of the deen, it's part of what Allah did, but culturally you need to put structures in place in order to, in a sense, operationalize and, in a sense, develop new ways of meaning, new ways of expression, and new ways of cultural identity and presence.
Shukran so much for that, Shaykh Ihsaan. And I'm going to say, in line with that, also what Dr. Abdullah he mentions and he emphasizes how while building a successful indigenous Muslim culture cannot be left to occur haphazardly. Speaking to this idea that there needs to be organization, there needs to be planning, because we must be producers of culture, he says, not passive consumers of it. Shaykh Ihsaan, shukran so much.
Let us remember also the other dimension. Look at last time when we had the elections and we had to have these very heavy political debates. Imagine our masajid become thriving spots and places where not only Muslims but the rest of society can come and listen to the values of justice and how the values of service leaders and servant leaders are promoted and in fact not only promoted but are in actual fact brought into fruition.
Because indeed it's for all humanity. Shukran so much, Shaykh Ihsaan. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.